This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit Podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. Steve Kranish is the creator of the Atari 8-Bit and Atari 5200 versions of Frogger, the versions published by Parker Brothers. Parker Brothers had the rights to publish cartridge versions of Frogger. Sierra Online had already published versions of the game on floppy disk and cassette, so Parker Brothers bought the rights to use that version as the basis for its cartridge version. But there were a few problems. For one, the 13K cassette game would need to be shrunk to fit on an 8K cartridge. Another, the source code was lost. Steve also worked on an Atari 8-bit version of the board game Risk and a game called Baker's Dozen, both of which were unfinished. He also worked on Project Zelda, Parker Brothers' investigation into distributing Atari VCS games via cable TV. This interview took place on March 2nd, 2025. In 2016, I interviewed John Harris, who programmed the Sierra Online version of Frogger, as well as Jawbreaker and Mouskattack. Check the show notes for the link to that.
I'm always amused that people remain interested in work that I did more than 40 years ago.
Sure.
Well, the vast majority of my career is in a dumpster somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine it probably happens in other industries. I mean, what if you were a fencer 40 years ago and you're building amazing fences in Montana, and then 40 years later somebody comes by and goes like, "Tell me about this fence you built," right? And you'd be like, "I don't know, it was a fence," right? But yeah, it happens in certain things, and computers and especially games is one of those. Um, so things that you said, that things that you make ended up in a dumpster. Um, how does that make you feel? How does that, you created all these things and then it ended up being short-lived at best.
Well, there are two different situations. If you work inside a large organization and you work on something that ultimately gets killed, gets, stopped or whatever, you wind up with this big black X on your forehead because you worked on something that for whatever reason was canceled. Which is the case at Parker. But I've spent most of my career as an independent consultant, and it ultimately, to me, it doesn't matter because whatever I worked on, I put a generic description of it without a company name associated in my resume. Right? What did you do? What did you work on? What tools did you use? Whether or not it wound up in a dumpster or was put into manufacturing doesn't matter.
Okay. That's a good attitude, I think.
Yeah.
All right. So I'd like to start before the beginning.
The general public doesn't understand this, that's part of engineering,
Sure.
that sometimes things get canceled. And part of it may be that you go down a path and then somebody finally realizes that this isn't going to work, it isn't going to sell, whatever. And I think I put this in an email to your bulletin board. I spent about a year working as an outside consultant for Kodak back when it was still Kodak.
Mm-hmm.
It was supposed to be a computer for Joe's six-pack. And this is in the very, very early days of portable computers when the simplest ones with one floppy disk and 640K memory cost $2,000. So the idea was that it worked off barcodes. It had a small LCD display on it. The barcodes came from a project that was actually originally in Byte magazine, where somebody had built a little critter that would roll over a piece of paper that had barcodes on it. And Kodak actually bought the rights to that, and they had one guy in the office who understood how it worked. And I know it was just one guy because he was a Vietnamese boat person. He didn't communicate very well because English was his second language, and there was nobody in that group who could have possibly backed him up. So anyhow, after a year on the project, some things became very obvious, which was this cute little barcode reader cost about $25 to manufacture. And for that kind of money, you could actually get a 3.5-inch floppy disk. And the rather poor quality, low contrast LCD screen cost about as much as a 6 or 7-inch CRT. So, but the problem was the form factor of the finished box had been sold to upper management, and they couldn't go to upper management and say, we changed our mind. It didn't fly at Coda. So they just killed the whole thing. And when I got the phone call about it being canceled, I was relieved because I realized it was a dead end. So that happens.
Sure. I'd like to start before the beginning. If you could tell me how you got into computers, how you first started playing with Atari machines. I know you weren't a big gamer, and that's fine, but this sort of education is.
I never owned a VCS.
Mhm.
I don't have any cartridges kicking around. I'm trying to remember. I bought the original IBM PC, but it must have been after Parker. So, I mean, I did some work with computers when I was a student, but that was a couple of 100 years ago when computers meant punch cards. And aside from punch cards, I used paper tape. I used paper. I mean, I actually got involved, and now you're reminding me of things. I got involved in computers when I was in about 10th grade. We had I guess, a pretty high quality school system. We had a math teacher who was very forward looking, and he managed to con a local time-sharing company. Remember time-sharing?
Sure.
Con a local time-sharing company into giving us access to their computer using an acoustical modem, which was probably, I don't know, 120 baud or something like that. So we wound up leasing a modem and two, I don't know whether they're ASR or KSR terminals that used paper tape as external storage. And I learned BASIC. Quite specifically, I wrote an interactive programming based on the Barrowman calculations for calculating the center of pressure of a model rocket in flight.
Okay.
Which went on for pages and pages. It was a complicated set of calculations, and Jim Barrowman, who was an aerospace engineer at NASA, had distilled them down to 3 or 4 pages. So that was my introduction to computers. It was, by the way, essentially the same thing at the same time as Bill Gates.
Mm-hmm.
But once I had finished my center of pressure calculation, I didn't know what to do next. So I really didn't do anything with them again until I got to college. I spent my first year of college at Syracuse University, where the language du jour was APL. And if you're not familiar with APL, it's a strange hieroglyphic language. It was essentially a write-only programming language because people didn't bother with comments. I mean, it was cool. You could write a very short line of code that would invert a matrix, but figuring out what you would have done later was very difficult. And then I moved on to Cornell, where we did stuff in what was called PLC, which was a PL1 derivative. And it was all on punch cards. And I wound up back at paper tape again when I took a computer structures class. And the computer structures class, the lab assignment was in groups of 8 to 10 students, build me an 8-bit microcomputer and tell me when you're done. That was the level of description of what we needed to do.
Wow.
We were given an 8-bit wide memory box with a keypad and display on it for entering programs. And we were given boxes of chips. The biggest chip was a 4-bit arithmetic logic unit. We did not have tri-state buffers, if those mean anything to you. Well, it meant all the buses need to be multiplexed. And as a group of 8 to 10, first of all, I should say, the scale of the project was such that it could not be a situation where 2 people said, we'll do all the work, you can just come along for the ride. We needed everybody. There was a huge amount of work involved. As a group, we had to agree on and design all of the random logic hardware for processor architecture. It should be noted that we were doing an 8-bit processor, and the class lectures were all on a wide word 18-bit processor. So we couldn't just lift stuff out of the class lessons and reuse it. And that was clearly quite intentional. But we had to design and implement an architecture, and then wire it all up on plug boards and loose wires. And the plug boards were not large enough to fit the whole system. So we had multiple boxes that had plug boards and power supplies in them, and they had connectors at each end of the box. So we had to divvy up the system into what would fit in one box, and then document what was on the cable going to the next box, and go through the process again at the next box until we had it all running. Efficiency was not an issue. The grade was based mostly on make it run. Show me you can make it run. So we could actually store stuff on paper tape. We could hand enter data into the memory box. Yeah, we had to have a serial port on it to connect to the terminal with paper tape. But keep in mind, we had nothing to work with, right? We had to invent
Sure.
our own instruction set. We had to decide, what the registers did, what the instructions did. I remember one of my contributions was people wanted more than one accumulator. So my thought was, why don't we do it like an HP calculator and have we had a 4-register stack, and 2 bits of the opcodes indicated which accumulator you were using. And if you needed a different accumulator, we would roll the stack just like on an HP calculator. And it worked. It ran. I don't think I have any of the schematics anymore. They were done on paper with colored pencils. The following year, I was a teaching assistant for the class.
What year was this, by the way?
This would have been 77, 78.
Yeah.
So like I said, a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was a teaching assistant for the class. The lab assignment was the same thing. And I got to deal with it all from the other viewpoint. I remember I had one group that I had to plead with, that they had become so obsessed with trying to make something efficient, ignoring the fact that this was running on, a couple of 100 kilohertz clock. And I said, doesn't matter if it's efficient, it needs to run. And my recollection is they just couldn't control themselves, and they never got it to run. So that's my introduction to computers. And one thing I remember from that was, having worked with things at basically the lowest silicon level, I understood what all the instructions, the opcodes, actually did. And I wound up, when I interviewed people for jobs, I would ask people who supposedly had a background in computer science, what exactly does a jump instruction do? And it amazed me the number of people who couldn't answer. It reloads the program counter. So, jump to subroutine tosses the program counter on the stack and reloads the program counter. But most people don't think that way anymore because people don't do stuff at that level. Or I don't know how many people still know how to write in assembly, but
yeah.
My early days, including my time at Parker, everything was in assembly.
So you learned assembly on this bespoke school project, and then later at Parker, when you had to do assembly, now you're using a different flavor of assembly, but more or less the same.
Everything that I dealt with, or almost everything, was 6502 based. And I remember interviewing somebody at Parker who, when I explained that what we were working with was all 6502 based, launched into this lecture about how it was an inefficient processor and that there were better processors and blah, 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 blah. It didn't matter, right? We weren't making game machines.
Yeah.
Right? We needed to deal with what the market was pushing.
Right.
If I remember correctly, the Coleco was based on a Z80.
I think that's right.
Which, is a couple of years later development, and it's different. The 6502 really qualifies as a RISC machine. It's pretty simple. But So anyhow, that's my introduction. I was an electrical engineering major. I took, I think, the two required computer science classes, but again, it was all punch cards. So
Mhm.
what the heck did I want to do with punch cards?
Yeah.
Um, and and if your audience doesn't know what punch cards are, I would say look them up and gasp.
So how did you end up at Parker Brothers?
If I remember correctly, well, I was living in Salem, Massachusetts at the time. And if I remember correctly, they were actually advertising in the local Salem paper
Hmm.
for engineers. I think they were
They,
being.
so
Hmm?
if a listener doesn't know what a punch card is, they probably also don't know what a newspaper is, but
Yeah, it's also possible, but they may have seen one somewhere. But I mean, I still have two newspapers delivered to my house every day. Um, but so anyhow, Parker was advertising. I mean, there was no internet. There was, there was no Craigslist. There was, I mean, jobs were advertised in the newspaper, or you talk to a recruiter,
Sure.
and dealing with recruiters cost the company looking for people money. So advertising in the Salem News was a cheap way to do it.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I responded to the ad and they were interested in me, but I wasn't pulled into the video games group. I was hired into what was called applied technology. And applied technology was to explore the application of new and upcoming technologies to what was by then the dying handheld market. Now,
Okay.
I don't know how many people remember handheld games. I think Simon is still out there.
Sure. And
I
Parker Brothers
think
had Merlin, right?
Well, I was about to get to that.
Okay.
Parker,
Sorry.
Merlin, no, that's okay. Merlin and Simon were very comparable games.
Hmm.
Simon came out of Milton Bradley, which was located out in the middle of Massachusetts, and Merlin came from Parker Brothers. Parker had been around since the late 1800s, and their big printing plant was in Salem. Not a trace of the plant exists anymore. The entire plot has been covered with a giant apartment complex that's right next to the train station. But there's no commemorative plaque. There's no little sign. There's nothing. And this was a company that was a major employer in Salem for decades. But the big thing about Merlin was, first of all, Merlin was developed outside of the company. Merlin was brought to Parker, I think, by a couple based out of Cambridge. And always willing to buy things from the outside, whether they were good or not. Parker bought into it. I have no idea what the royalty structure or anything else was, but it was a huge, huge success. For people who are not familiar with Merlin, it was about the size of a telephone handset, which I suspect a lot of the audience doesn't know about. Um, I actually have one put away somewhere, but see if I can get this in the picture properly. That's a classic telephone handset. It was a little larger than that. I think it had a 9 or 10 character keyboard, and under each key was an LED, and you could play a bunch of relatively simple logic games on it. You could play tic-tac-toe on it. You could play some other simple logic games. It's not meant for an adult. It's meant for a 6-year-old. But it was hugely successful. So successful that the company, the management and engineering and game design all moved out of the Salem facility, and they moved to a brand new building built to Parker specs in Beverly. Although it was near the Route 128 highway, it was hidden in the woods. It had a lake in back, which I don't think belonged to Parker. But it was neatly cut into the trees. They did not clear the lot. They neatly cut into the trees and left as many as possible. And it was literally the building that Merlin built. And then it had been further expanded to one side, and that's where the electronic engineering group wound up. Now, I should say the concept of electronic engineering in a company that had been really just a printing company for, decades and decades was a bit of a struggle. Prior to this bunch of bright young engineers arriving, the marketing bozos controlled absolutely everything. If they told the game designer make that square red, it became a red square. And dealing with electronics, especially dealing with the timing sensitive Atari VCS, the engineers could push back and say, no, I can't make that green. And they hated us for it. They no longer had absolute control over everything. But it was a different experience for management.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and another thing I should point out is that although Parker was an old line Yankee company, it was at that time owned by General Mills.
Hmm.
And General Mills understood the concept of cash cows, right? Certain cereals sold better than others, and you just pushed them, and that was that. Well, the toy and game business, some years there's a hot product, and some years there's not. And they couldn't deal with it. They wanted there to be a hot new product every single year. They couldn't deal with the fact that some years you just had to accept things as cash cows, and that was the best you were going to do.
Mm-hmm.
You weren't going to wind up with something that was a huge, huge hit. But I mean, my short story on Parker was basically a fun group of people to work with in engineering, but the upper management was mostly a bunch of bozos.
Mm-hmm.
And the president of the company at that time was Randy Barton, whose mother was a Parker. So even though they no longer owned the company, there was a direct connection to the long-term history of the company. Um,
So you saw that in the paper, you started working for them. What were you hired to do
well,
initially?
I was hired to look at technologies that might be used in handheld games like Merlin.
Hmm.
And there were a number of them. If I thought to dig them out before we talked, I could show you. There was one called Bank Shot that was a handheld pool game.
Okay.
If you look it up online, you can probably find pictures of it. And there were others. Now, I don't remember if this made it out the door, but there was one game that was physically based on the binocular-like instrument that Luke Skywalker uses in one of the opening scenes of the original Star Wars.
Okay.
It's just, he's holding this thing up.
Mm-hmm.
And we built a game. I think it was using a vacuum fluorescent display, but the game display was inside. And today we'd have accelerometers and tilt measurement and this and that and everything else. It was, it had a couple of buttons on top. That was it. I don't remember the game at all. I honestly don't remember if it made it out the door. Again, there's the issue of some things don't make it out the door.
Sure.
And sometimes it's because somebody in marketing doesn't like it. Sometimes it's because it's too expensive to manufacture. There are a bunch of things that come up.
Yeah.
But that was one of the cool things that we did. But I kind of became an engineer at large. If something needed to be done, I was assigned to it. So I did reverse engineering on the Mattel and television,
Hmm.
and basically recreating the schematics of this rather dense board.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I will say in those days it was all through-hole components, which made it easier. Today it would be all surface mount. It would be damn near impossible. It can be done. I mean, it clearly does get done, but it would just be a lot more work. I never had a microscope on my desk, whereas if it were on surface mount, I would. So I did that. I did something with the ColecoVision, but I don't remember what.
Hmm.
Anyhow, the two other projects I wound up on, I may get the order wrong, but they were Zelda and Frogger. I know I've been asked over the years if Zelda had some connection to the video game about, name
Legend of
something,
Zelda,
something.
right?
Anyhow, no connection at all.
Zelda was the send games over cable television thing,
Yes,
right? Okay.
that was it. And I should first of all say, in engineering departments, it's very common to have what is essentially code names for projects.
Sure.
And part of the reason is marketing is going to have their own name. for the project, and it's likely to be the name of the week, and they're going to argue over it. And basically, from the engineering perspective, who the hell cares? And we in order to separate various projects that are going on, we need to give them names and keep the names.
Sure.
So Zelda was this really for Parker massive engineering project. There must have been 5 or 6 of us on it. And the basic idea was we could stuff 20 game cartridges into the blanking intervals of a cable TV channel. So we didn't even need to use up the whole TV channel. We could actually put a TV channel in there too, as long as you had the proper decoding equipment on the other end.
So this is like the vertical blank interrupt. At the same time, they could send closed captionings or something, and instead of that, we're sending games.
You're sending games, and
Okay.
then there was a special cartridge that was made for the Atari VCS, and it had a connector on the top of it that would connect to your cable box.
Yeah.
And that's how you got data into it. And then the cartridge ran a menu, and the menu was actually had downloaded data of what games were available. And the idea was that they could push old games, they could uh, tease new games, right? Put a brand new game on there, and it's available for the weekend, and it's
Yeah.
available on your Atari VCS until you turn it off. But you can't play anything else on it.
Right.
So my responsibility in the project was essentially the entire head end. I mean, I did everything except the RF stuff to connect it to a TV channel. But what I did was, I don't remember how many we actually built, but it was intended to hold 20 boards. There were various discussions about how to get the code into it, and I finally just said, I was just going to put a connector on the end of each board, and we'll stick a cartridge in it. That's it. That's where the data comes from. So we must have done, 5, 6, 7 of them. Most of them were built by one technician, a fellow named Bill Kazor, who was just an outstanding technician. When he handed me a board, it was wired according to the schematic. And if I'd gotten the schematic right and he hadn't caught an error anywhere, they worked. So it would serialize and interleave all of the data onto a serial cable. And as far as we got with it was it went over the wall of a cubicle. But the cable over the cubicle wall would someday be a TV channel. To basically this was the time when cable was a big thing, and lots of places were being wired for cable. And cable, CATV as it was called, once upon a time meant community area television, where you'd have um, a local antenna that was looking up at a geosynchronous satellite. And that's how people got anything beyond the usual broadcast channels.
Sure.
So eventually the project got killed. Now, at the time, we really weren't told why it got killed. But the version of the story that I was fed was that Parker's so-called management had assumed that because Atari was owned by Warner Amex Cable at the time, that they must be working on the same thing. And they had much deeper pockets, and therefore would get way ahead of Parker, and they would do it, and they would just wipe us out. And my boss, John Gates, was part of a meeting that I didn't know about until many years later, where he and 1 or 2 other management people actually went to talk to Warner Amex. And as they walked around the Warner Amex offices, they noticed on whiteboards all sorts of drawings that implied a very similar sort of system. And there were diagrams about how it would all work and what would go where. And anyhow, the end result was that Parker management was terrified. They were convinced that Warner Amex was doing this, that they were ahead of them, and therefore Parker shouldn't do it. The reality was, it turned out, Warner Amex had done nothing. It was just stuff on a whiteboard.
Scribbles.
Didn't mean anything. It was really just meant to scare the people from Parker.
Hmm.
But they had done nothing at all. Now, John found this out years later when somebody who worked for him in a later job was leaving, and they wound up in a discussion about something. And it turned out this fellow who was leaving had been one of the engineers at Warner Amex who was responsible for covering these whiteboards with diagrams and equations. And so this was eventually relayed to me, but Warner Amex had nothing. That Parker was just a bunch of cowards.
Hmm.
The most distressing thing of all was that this would have been the first use of distributing information other than video over a cable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This would have been the roots of what we now call the internet. And it would have been under the control of Parker Brothers and General Mills. And it would have been, I don't know, 20 years before the internet kind of crept out from under DARPANet. So there was a potential there
Yeah.
for Parker to essentially own the world, and they did nothing with it.
Wow. The idea was, I don't know the timeline. I don't know who was first. I'm not here to litigate that, but I do know that Mattel was working on a similar thing for Intellivision. There's actually some prototypes out there of this little cable receiving box.
Okay.
So, so yeah, I think it was something that was in the air. People like, yeah, what are other ways we can distribute games other than just selling boxes at the grocery store or whatever, the toy store.
Yeah, I think the biggest distributor was Toys R Us, and
Hmm.
that might have been part of the problem, which is that Toys R Us was the big distributor of board games. And
Sure,
by essentially cutting them out of the loop for video games, it was going to severely affect the relationship with the board game side of the company.
sure. I can imagine. So you worked on this. How long did you work on this project? I mean, a year? I mean, just
I would guess a year. I never tried to make up a timeline for. I spent
yeah,
2 years at Parker,
yeah.
um, but yeah, it was probably a year. And as I said, putting 5 or 6 people on a project for a year for the Parker Electronics Engineering Group was a big, big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, I did the head end. Mylan Murhar did the receiving end hardware. Ray Miller did the menu that ran on the receiving end hardware. And we had hired a new guy to basically do the RF stuff.
Hmm.
Sorry, I don't remember his name. And then we had 2 technicians working for us.
Hmm.
So it was a big deal.
So was that the first project you did, and then Frogger came after that?
I don't remember the order. I
Okay.
think Frogger came after that because I was working on video games through the rest of my time at Parker.
Okay.
Now, I don't want my former coworkers to get upset about this. They know. They were a very um, insular group, I guess, because they had all basically hired each other. And I never went through their interview process because I was already there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I had more than adequately proven myself capable of doing whatever I was asked to do.
But you felt like an outsider at the time at the games, the
I was
programming.
always an outsider in
Yeah.
the games. It just was. And I've been surprised when I've been invited to a couple of things over the years. It's been many, many years since we've gotten together. I have remained vaguely in touch with a couple of people. Dawn Stockbridge lives not too far from here, but I occasionally communicate with her on Facebook. Ray Miller eventually moved to the Mystic, Connecticut area, and I see him on Facebook once in a while.
Hmm.
So again, the young audience probably doesn't know what Facebook is.
It's
Uh,
for the best. That's okay. Let's not explain it to them.
um, and that's kind of it. I've occasionally seen Don Miffett on the Minuteman Rail Trail in Lexington on inline skates, but I've never stopped to talk to him. Um, I refuse. So anyhow, I had amply proven myself at this point, and then came this project to do Frogger. Now there was a 2600 version of Frogger, which I think was pretty successful.
Mhm.
And Parker had actually bought the rights to distribute Frogger in cartridges. Now think about how weird the world was back then, that there were different versions of the distribution rights for floppy disks.
Mm-hmm.
And I would suggest to a younger audience, go look up floppy disks. You don't know what they are.
I promise you my audience knows what a floppy disk is, but yes.
But these were the 5 1/4s.
Yeah.
These were real floppies. Um, and cassette tapes. Cassette tapes were still a big thing back then because the medium was cheap and the players were cheap. And you could
Mhm.
plug a cassette player into a number of the early home computers.
Sure.
And anyhow, Parker just saw cartridges, and that's what they were interested in. So Sierra Online had a version of Frogger that was being distributed, I think, on floppies and cassettes.
Mm-hmm. And it was written by
Uh,
John Harris.
Harris. Yeah, it
Mm-hmm.
was written by John Harris. And in order to accelerate the process of getting a port to the Atari 400, 800 computers at the time out the door quickly, they negotiated a deal with Sierra to adapt John Harris's version. There was one catch. There was no source code. Harris had lost the source code. And which to me is bizarre. I mean, in one way or another, I make up duplicates of stuff. I mean, when I was younger, I was terrified and I would do backups on a very frequent basis. Now I'm
Mm-hmm.
likely to do them, a month or 2 months or whatever. But the equipment's much more reliable. I also don't walk around with the source code in my shirt pocket. Um, so anyhow, they had lost the source code, and so they came to me with a cassette image of 13K and asked if I could condense it down to 8K and make it a two-player game. And I think there were other things they asked about too, but those were the two big things. Were really three things. One, can I deal with it being object code? Can I get it from 13K down to 8? And can we make it a two-player game? Oh, and can you do this in 6 weeks? We're trying to get it out the door before the end of the fiscal year. I'm serious. They wanted to get it out the door before the end of the fiscal year. I had
Mm-hmm.
6 weeks to do this.
Sure.
Absurd. Now, the first tool I got to work with was one of the other guys had written a three-path disassembler for 6502 code. And the reason it was three-path was that the opcodes for the 6502 were 1, 2, or 3 bytes. And it would do a complete disassembly of all the possible code. Basically would dump it out from a line printer output. Okay, kids, look up line printer. Um, um, so it would dump out 3 columns of possible code and then a 4th column of a dump to graphics because
If
we
it
didn't
was
know what was what. We had
right.
no idea what was what.
Right.
And it was up to me looking at printed listings to figure out what was what. And it turned out Harris had written the code originally on a cassette storage Atari computer. So he never had a full view of all the code. And it was written in chunks. I mean, sort of all he could deal with
Mm-hmm.
was chunks of it. And I found in the dumped source, I found code, I found debris, I found graphics. So really the first big step in was essentially reverse engineering of somebody else's code was to figure out what was what. This was done with a bunch of big highlighter markers going through the code and marking it up, and then going back to my version of the source code and adding labels for all of the jumps and jumps to subroutines and so forth, and adding labels for where there was clearly graphics, and then discarding all of the debris and then rebuilding it again and looking at the byte count. And the only person who helped me on this was Dawn Stockbridge. And she redid the graphics. She helped me figure out what some of the code was doing. And she did something with the music, but you'd have to ask her. I don't know. But basically for 6 weeks, um, I'd ride my bike a little, I'd sleep a little, and I typed and I read. There's a lot of reading listings and figuring out what all this stuff was doing. And I did what they asked. I delivered it on time. I honestly had no clue how many cartridges were sold. Nobody would tell me.
Mhm. So this
What
wasn't a royalty deal for you. It was just,
I was an employee,
yeah, employee. All right.
right?
Yeah.
And there was some kind of release bonus that everybody else got, which ultimately nobody told me what it was, and I never got it because I put an Easter egg in it. Now, all the predecessor games, all the previous games, had some kind of Easter egg in it, including the ones that were written by people who were ostensibly managers. So I put an Easter egg on level 6 or 7. When you jumped on the Lady Frog turned into my initials. I went by the name Bird at the time, so it said BK. I couldn't, and for the life of me, have played to that level. But some playtester did, and they found it. And I had gone off with my girlfriend on a week-long bike trip. And remember in those days, um, there were no cell phones. Kids look up pre-cell phone.
That was glorious.
That meant you could disappear,
Yeah.
right? You were just, nobody was going to get a hold of me. And so they sent one of the other engineers to see if he could find where this was in the code. And it was obvious where it was in the code. Everything, including this section of code, was all commented. I'm to this day, I wrote far more comments than I do code. Part of it is because things come back and haunt me, and I don't want to figure out what I did
Mhm.
5 years ago. So if I was ever going to get a bonus, I never got anything. I don't think I even got much of a thank you. But anyhow, that kind of launched me into playing with video games. The next thing I did was I wrote a manual for how to port a 400/800 game to the Atari 5200, which they were done by different divisions within Atari,
Hmm.
which is just typical of the incredibly stupid management of
Right.
Atari.
Yeah.
They took the
One was
same hardware,
consumer products and one was computing. Yeah. Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
because it was a game company, they never really had much of a market as business machines. This was the Apple II era, and the Apple II developed a reputation as a business machine, even though you could play games on it.
Yeah.
The Atari was actually a much better game machine because it was designed to be a game machine. But anyhow, the 400/800 and subsequent 1200 all used the same physical hardware as the 5200, but the memory map was changed. In other words, the addresses of all of the ICs was moved, and they changed the controller. So it's not like from a spring action to an unsprung joystick, which is terrible for game playing with,
Hmm.
whatever. Um, and it was, I guess you could have possibly done it with a giant FPGA to build a box that you'd plug the cartridge into, and you then plug that into the 5200. But it would have been absurd. So I understood what the memory map was. All this stuff was published for the 400/800 because it was treated as an open computer, right? There were programming manuals for it,
Yeah.
but there weren't for the 5200. So I had to reverse engineer all the hardware, figure out what the new addresses were, and then figure out how to deal with that stupid joystick. And aside from that, it's basically the same game. And I honestly don't know if Parker ever released anything else for the 5200. Couldn't tell you.
Do you still have that document?
Probably not.
But if you do, you'll tell me and let me scan it, right?
If I find it someday, I'll tell you. Now, there was somebody. I'm jumping ahead here. I'll get to it in a minute. So anyhow, um, after finishing up these, two versions of Frogger, I was actually assigned something new to work with. I worked on a version of Risk. And if I remember correctly, the game itself was finished. What wasn't finished was the map and the computer player.
Hmm.
Now, I know there was a paper written by somebody in academia at Parker's request about how to structure a computer opponent.
Hmm.
I don't know if I have that either, or if anybody has that.
Hmm. Interesting. Well,
But
that'd be
yeah,
interesting to see.
they actually they went to somebody in academia who was well versed in game theory
Mhm.
to write how, basically what a computer opponent would behave like.
Hmm.
And the other thing that was, I mean, if you remember the game Risk, there's a deck of cards,
Mhm.
right? And you draw from the deck and you keep those cards secret. And we had no clue how to implement this, other than saying, don't look at the screen right now. Don't look at the
Yeah,
screen.
yeah.
It's not going to work. So we did, once we had the game up and running, we did play testing with it. I grabbed somebody else from the department and we would sit and play Risk all day. Think about this for a second. We were paid to come into the office and play games. This was a play testing, and what we discovered was that the cards were to move the game along quickly. That because of all the time spent moving armies around and so forth, this was to essentially accelerate the game. And just as a side point, there have been various derivations of Monopoly with essentially the same goal. Because if you remember, Monopoly is a long, slow-playing game. So anyhow, we discarded the cards. It just wasn't any good reason for it. And if I remember correctly, it was quite playable. Um, but I never got to finish it up. And again, I don't remember the order of these things. The other thing I worked on was a game that we called Baker's Dozen. And Baker's Dozen was intended to be, kind of Super Cobra, kind of Frogger, all blended into one. The idea of being one of these game in a cave type things for people who didn't like shooting, right? For people who like Frogger. Frogger apparently was very popular with girls.
Mhm.
Even though the frogs get squished, it wasn't violent. It wasn't like any of the shoot 'em ups. Um, so um, that never got finished. I don't think that ever got past artwork.
Hmm.
We have some wonderful, very basic artwork for how that was going to work, but it involved robots throwing pies and bags of flour getting dumped on you and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So I
Sounds like
think
it could have been cute.
it could have been cute. It could have been a disaster. Well, because as I've said, I'm not really a gamer. I wasn't then, and I'm not now. So somebody else was going to have to help me come up with good game playing ideas. But that was all doable. The important thing was having somebody, on staff who was going to actually program the game.
And why did that one get killed, do you think?
I think we ran out of time before they laid off half of us.
Oh, sure.
So I think it just, wasn't high enough in the queue. There's also Parker suffered from a really bad reverse not invented here philosophy. A not invented here philosophy is what happens in some companies where they're unwilling to accept ideas from outside. And Parker had it backwards. They were willing to pay good money for bad ideas from outside rather than accepting good ideas from people inside the company that cost them nothing. And that may have suffered from the same problem. Now, I've been asked, why didn't Parker immediately launch into making computer versions of their large collection of board games? And I suspect, I'm sure the decision came from the marketing bozos, but I suspect that there was nobody to copy, right? Parker did not create a game system that copied Atari's game system to make games. And the limitations of the VCS meant that a lot of the things that went on in the games were copied from other games. So it's just the nature of the hardware that we were dealing with. And there was nothing to copy, right? Nobody else was doing it.
Right.
And I don't think the marketing bozos could really visualize it. The board game implementations came along later, dealing with higher resolution screens and more colors and lots more memory. So so anyhow, somewhere in all of that, this must have been, I'm sorry, I'm going to blank here whether it was 82 or 83. I think it must have been 83. The Christmas sales projections for the summer of 83, that's when the big orders came from places like Toys R Us, were quite poor. The industry was running into problems. One was that um, a lot of people had gotten a hold of the programming information for how to write for the Atari VCS.
Sure.
So you had a number of little programming groups that were writing cartridges. And these wound up in the $5 bins. They were mostly terrible, and they wound up in the $5 bins at Toys R Us or wherever, probably KB Toys and stuff like that. Um, and they kind of drowned out the better quality games that sold for $30 or $35. The American public can be amazingly gullible, and they would go into the store and there's $5 cartridges and there are $35 cartridges. Which were they buying? They were buying the $5 crap. So that had a serious impact on the industry as a whole. We didn't realize it at the time, but the first Nintendo system sold in the US was headed our way. Now it didn't really show up in public for another 2 years or so, but I saw it in the office of the president of Parker Brothers sitting on a credenza while I was still there. And like so many potentially good ideas, Parker did nothing. Think about
Amazing.
that.
Huh.
They let Nintendo into the country on their own
Mm-hmm.
rather than grabbing distribution rights when there was possible. Again, visionless. Atari was stumbling badly. The ET game that they had created that was supposed to be such a big hit was really just crap.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
and
And the video
Parker had
game
an
market
opportunity.
crashed, and then it was quiet for a couple of years until the Nintendo came out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyhow, we had this whole charade going on at Parker. Prior to the summer orders of 93 or 83, um, the engineering group had been expanding, and they had decided rather than building another edition, they would lease space in another building, I don't know, half a mile away. And so we would wind up trading our view of the trees from our windows for a one-story building with constant traffic outside our door. And then some marketing bozo decided that if we actually picked up and moved, it would send the wrong message, if you can figure that one out, to upper management. And so we never moved. They had leased the space. They undoubtedly were obligated to pay for the space, but we never moved. So instead, they shrank our cubicles, continued to hire people. And in the end, this would have been about November of 83. I think I have the year right. But anyhow, it would have been November. Um, they had just hired one person in the engineering group in October. And I cannot believe the people who did that didn't know what was coming. Parker was a typical part of a large corporation, slow-moving, ponderous, conservative, terrified. I mean, they couldn't decide whether or not to pick their nose in 3 months. They would have known 3 months ahead what was coming. And I remember cornering my boss's boss in a stairwell and asking, there are all these rumors about layoffs. What's going on? And being a good corporate soldier, he did what good corporate soldiers do. He lied to me. And what I did was, go ahead, arrest me for this. I took a lot of stuff from my office home. I think I had intentionally driven to work that day. Most days I bicycled to work, but I think I had intentionally driven to work because nobody was looking at it. And I took home papers and listings and discs and all kinds of stuff, figuring that if nothing happened, I could bring them back. And if we all got laid off, nobody would miss it. right? It wasn't going to matter. Whatever I worked on was just going in a dumpster. And the following day I came in and there was an armed guard by the door. Um, and we basically had till noon to get out out of the building.
Wow.
And that was it.
That was it.
That was it. I discovered that all my experience in video games was a completely worthless skill set. Never worked on cartridge-based games again. I did wind up. Actually, what happened was a manager who had been at Parker had previously moved to Spinnaker Software, which is a non-curriculum-based educational game company at the time. They were based out of Cambridge. So anyhow, he brought me in as an outside consultant. And I went from being a hapless employee to being an outside consultant, primarily working out of an office in my own home. And if I hadn't already bought it, I bought an original IBM PC with a floppy disk drive. I think within a year, I had bought the expansion console, which essentially turned it into an XT, which had kids, are you ready for this? 10 megabyte disk drive.
You're never going to fill that. It's huge.
Yeah.
Yeah. My first
So
XT
anyhow,
also had 10 megabyte.
I worked for Spinnaker on and off for a couple of years.
So the stuff that you liberated from the office, the source code and stuff, did you still have it? Did you have it, has it been digitized?
There was a fellow, I don't remember where I met him, but there was a fellow who was trying to create a video game museum.
Mm-hmm.
His name was Matt, and I think I've seen him referenced somewhere.
Okay.
But he was collecting stuff, and it was just, I have to confess, this is probably the only time in my life I have done this. I decluttered my house by giving him almost everything.
Hmm.
Now, I don't know what you can see in the image here.
Yeah.
But back of me is a little bit of a very cluttered office that has dozens of electronic instruments and I don't know, probably a couple of thousand books. I'm terrible about decluttering. So anyhow, I think I've covered most of it. That was my history of Parker Brothers. Now, there's always been some interest in not only my work, but the work of everybody else.
Sure.
And Digital Press did interviews with us. I think they were invited to Laura Nikolich's party. And they actually took videos of interviews with people at that time. That was about 20 years ago.
Yeah, they've done some great work and interviews and
yeah, it's interesting. You know, again, pretty much everything else I've done wound up in a dumpster somewhere.
yeah.
So the idea that anybody would even attempt to record the history of some of this stuff is, you know, is interesting. I've seen Retro Gamer magazine.
Mm-hmm.
I've picked up a couple of editions of it when they had stuff about Parker. Never had anything about me. They never contacted me directly. I suppose I should email them and say, if you're ever interested in writing up Frogger, I'm available. But that's really up to them. You know, they covered some of the Star Wars games. The Star Wars license was a huge, huge deal for Parker.
Sure.
So anyhow, after the big boom of video games, General Mills wanted out. And I've forgotten I think what they did was they initially combined Kenner Toys and Parker Brothers. I kind of spun it out to the shareholders as a freestanding company. And then that company bought Kenner Parker Toys and then bought they spun it out. I'm sorry, I'm garbling things here. Kenner Parker bought Tonka, which makes, you know, metal trucks and
yeah,
and so forth. You know, basically toys. So it became Kenner Parker Tonka, and that was eventually bought out by Hasbro. And it was bought up by Hasbro. They paid less than Kenner Parker had paid for Tonka. So that's just kind of the dynamics of businesses buying businesses. And for a long time they kept the old brand names alive. There was a time when Hasbro's website had a page for every one of the companies they had swallowed. How many people have heard of Selchow and Ryder? Familiar? You probably played some of their games. They
Say the name of the company again.
Selchow and Ryder.
No, I don't know it.
Parcheesi,
Okay, sure.
Scrabble.
Yes.
Okay, well those were their big hits.
Hmm.
That was one of the companies that was swallowed up.
Hmm.
They swallowed Coleco, I think actually out of a bankruptcy auction.
Hmm.
They swallowed Milton Bradley. There's quite a long list.
Yeah.
And the page about Parker, they covered my 2 years at Parker entirely by the space between two sentences. So all of that's disappeared. The brand names have all disappeared. Everything
Yeah.
is now Hasbro.
Yeah. Wild.
Yeah, I mean, I recently picked up a copy of Monopoly at Staples because they were on sale,
Hmm.
and it's Hasbro Monopoly. And as you're probably aware, Hasbro has been involved in all kinds of licensing stuff with Monopoly.
Sure. Yeah.
When I was at Parker a couple hundred years ago, Parker was very, very protective of what was considered the family jewels. They got involved in lawsuits with people who tried to make knockoff games. Godiva Chocolate wanted to sell a chocolate Monopoly set. Not just a few little bits, but a whole set all done in chocolate. And Parker was amenable to that because they were kind of a top line chocolate manufacturer. And the licensing fee was 2 chocolate Monopoly sets. They put one in the cafeteria in Salem and one in the cafeteria in Beverly. And we got to eat the licensing fee.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Real weird.
So anyhow, we've been talking for an hour. What else
Yeah.
would you like to know?
I'd like to know about you today. Jumping ahead, 2025, what are you up to these days?
Well, post Parker, I have spent most of my time as an independent consultant working out of an office in my house. I think, I did work for Spinnaker. I never wrote a game for them, but I did essentially the portable underpinnings for a number of text-based games. They had done a series of adventure games back when text-based adventure games were a big
Sure.
thing.
Hmm.
And they did them for a number of platforms. There were some graphics involved. I mean, they weren't bang bang shoot 'em ups, but they were anyhow. In order to make it practical to do these things, Spinnaker had created a game description language they used for actually writing the games. But that game description package sat on top of what we call I/O bindings. They were basically the code that connected it to whatever computer it was going to run on.
Right.
And I was one of the people who did this, wrote I/O bindings for the Apple II, the Commodore 64, and the Atari 400, 800. And I think, the 1200 when it came along, the Amiga when it came along. And the idea was to have a common code set. So I was very much involved in that.
Sure.
So, basically bit diddling the hardware
Hmm.
at the lowest level. So anyhow, that was part of their stuff. They put into games initially under the name Trillium, and then wound up in a lawsuit with somebody who claimed he owned the name Trillium. So they wound up training it to Tellurium. This is people with big egos and deep pockets and nothing better to do with their time. But so anyhow, did a bunch of stuff for them. I actually wrote some non-curriculum based educational companies for another game company that was trying to teach kids about different countries, Ticket to Spain, Ticket to Paris, and they were anyhow non-curriculum educational. I did audio hardware for the Amiga. which didn't
Nice.
have a good, didn't have it plugged in the parallel port. The Amiga didn't have a good audio output, which made absolutely no sense. I did a fairly sophisticated audio card for the Apple II GS. And for all the kids out there really was an Apple II GS. It was
It's a
an
great
extension.
machine.
It was an extension of the Apple II
Yeah.
with much better graphics and much better sound.
Yeah.
And I don't remember the other details of the computer. I did a lot of work years ago on the Apple II and eventually the 2GS. And I will tell the kids out there who've heard of those, Wozniak was a clever engineer, but sometimes he was much too clever. The way he had organized the video memory was horrifically wasteful of memory in a computer that nominally only had 64K or less. That he was trying too hard to be clever and save a few pennies on the board. And as a result, those of us who wrote code for the computer had to create lookup tables in RAM in order to be able to use the video memory.
Right. Because the high-res screen was non-contiguous memory. And yeah, you couldn't just write to the draw to the screen. You had to know
you had to go
use your
through and add
tables.
this lookup table
Yeah.
to be able to write to the screen
Yeah.
in a reasonable amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
That to go through all the calculations for every pixel was absurd. So I mean, I don't remember all the projects I've worked on. I know some of these things were prototypes, proof of concept, basically stuff that was headed for a dumpster no matter what. Certainly nothing as visible as Frogger.
Sure.
And eventually I wound up doing some consulting work for Boston Acoustics. Does anybody remember Boston Acoustics? They have reappeared. I mean, when I was there and when I left, I figured that within 5 years they would be one of a basket of brand names owned by somebody else. I think it took them 3.5 years to get that way. And then they disappeared entirely. Whoever owned the company stopped manufacturing anything, stopped selling anything. And I know from other Boston Acoustics alumni that the name has reappeared. Certainly none of us. But I was very much involved in home theater. So I wound up as the chief electrical engineer, essentially over the home theater projects. And I went to work and got paid to watch movies. There were a handful of choice movies that we would use as audio test sources. There was a James Bond movie where I think it was Pierce Brosnan that was driving a tank around a city. And the bass track was great for testing subwoofers. I think the Sixth Sense, the Fifth Sense, something like that was a movie that also had a great bass track. So I could actually bring my son to work with me and just sit him down in front of a television and a DVD player. He was happy for the day. So I mean, we also designed a lot of good hardware. I still have, and as chief EE, I got to test a lot of hardware. Now, Boston Acoustics had a very strict no be goods policy. Does everybody know what that means? It means there was no outlet store. There were no scratch sales. They had a crusher and they would literally just throw things in and crush them. And my technician would grab things out of the stack of stuff that was to be crushed. He sent me home with a pair of tower speakers and a couple of different home theater systems. I think I counted at one point there were 42 speakers in my house.
Nice.
Unfortunately, the house got hit by lightning. I got a lightning strike on a tree outside my office, and the lightning went down the tree, jumped onto my composite deck, traveled across the deck, blew up a deck board, which is still blown up. I haven't replaced it. Traveled across the composite deck, found an AC outlet on the outside of the house. Traveled the loop from the AC outlet, which destroyed virtually all of my equipment, all of my audio and video equipment, except for the Digital Theater 7000, for which I was the chief engineer. Oops. It stood up to the shock on the line better than anything else. There were three
Wow.
subwoofers. It blew up all the subwoofers. One of them, it did not really blow the fuse. It detonated the fuse. Um, I eventually found it, but it was literally just a detonated device. Um, but yeah, I wound up with a lot of speakers at home, and the launch sequence in Apollo 13 has a great bass track of a thump, 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 which is basically the heartbeat of the ship as it's being woken up. And if you don't have subwoofers, you don't hear it. You don't know it's there. Um, so one of these days I need to pull them apart and try and fix the subwoofers, or just punt and find a new pair of speakers or used pair of speakers on Craigslist. So anyhow, I was there for, I don't know, 2.5 years. Without going into the whole history of Boston Acoustics, um, their approach to new product development was to see what Tweeter had, and offer to make something similar for 10% less. So the marketing people would go down the street to Tweeter, look at what was new, maybe take some notes, and that was what we were going to do. The problem was, if nobody had done something, they weren't interested in it. There was nobody to compete against. So my group built a prototype of a surround sound system for one of the early PlayStations, and it was designed specifically to go with the PlayStation. The box that it sat in was essentially a match to the PlayStation, and then it came with a bunch of speakers, and it was years ahead of Bose, literally years. But marketing didn't know what to do with it because nobody else was doing it, so they just threw it away. That was typical of Boston Acoustics. So I have no knowledge of what's going on now, but I assume whoever owned the brand name decided it was worth something and they would license it out. But part of the thing about Boston Acoustics back in the day was that Andy Katsotos, I think that's how it's pronounced, the president of the company, the founder of the company, had his own idea about what things would sound like. And everything had to pass his ear test, had to pass his listening test, including the relatively inexpensive computer speaker sets. So anyhow, I was there for a while. I eventually left. I was in an odd position because I couldn't offer my great gang of engineers anything new coming down the pipe. All we had in front of us was, can you squeeze 20 cents out of this? Can you squeeze $1 out of that? That's not a good way to keep a group of very bright, very ambitious young engineers occupied. It's a way to get them bored very quickly. So I'll be honest here, I literally encouraged my staff to leave, and had at least one experience where one of my guys had listed me as a reference, and I got a phone call from a potential employer wanting to know, why is this guy listing his current manager as a reference? So I explained, there's nothing new for us to do here. And that, basically once I got divorced, that's what's going on in my life at the time. Once I got divorced, I would be leaving too. And I left, went from there to a very obscure division of Motorola, that basically designed printer acceleration for laser printers and inkjet printers. And this is pretty obscure stuff, but I got to learn a moderate amount about lasers. I got to learn a lot about inkjet printers. And the short story that I have for people about inkjets versus lasers is, if you print 10 pages in color a day, or even 10 pages a week, you're okay to buy an inkjet. If you print 1 or 2 pages a month, buy a laser. And the reason is, the inkjet nozzles will dry out and they'll clog. And if you listen to an inkjet printer going clunk, 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 it's basically blowing its nose. And you'll waste most of your ink in the nose blowing process. That for very occasional use, a laser is a much better investment. You can buy a laser, low volume laser for $100. Don't waste your money on ink cartridges. What I was involved in there was an inkjet printer that would sell on a blister pack at CVS or Staples for $30 and not lose money. The business model for inkjets at that time was that they gave away the printers in 20, $30, $50, whatever, and then charged a small fortune for the cartridges.
Sure.
And while that works in the US and Europe, or Western Europe, it doesn't work in Eastern Europe, and it doesn't work in the third world, because people don't have the money to buy the expensive cartridges. So the model had to get flipped on its head. So I was involved. I took a project that was unfinished, that nobody seemed to know how to fix, and fixed it without having any hardware in front of me. Not a trivial task. But a lot like Frogger. I mean, the project was partially done, and I needed to reverse engineer it to find the problems. What did I do after that? I went back to consulting. We all got laid off. I mean, Motorola was in the process of disintegrating. We watched as all the bonus money went to Chris Galvin, who was the CEO when I was there. And he was the grandson of the founder. The family name of the company and the original name of the company was Galvin Engineering. So when you see the name Motorola on something now, it's licensed. I mean, I think that there's still a Motorola that's involved in cell phone head ends, but anything else is just licensed. I think the phone name is actually Lenovo.
Do you still consult today? Are you retired or?
Anyhow, let me finish up a little bit more.
Yeah.
I wound up doing some consulting. I wound up working for iRobot, which is the company that makes
Vacuum
Roomba
cleaner
vacuums.
company.
Yeah. So I was involved in, I was one of the people who designed Roombas for a couple of years. I was involved in things like figuring out how to detect and eject objects. So for instance, you could, using my part of the code, you could turn a Roomba over and turn it on, turn it over, and I could play catch with it. I could throw a sock at it. It would ingest the sock, recognize it as something it shouldn't have in it, and throw it back at me. So I wound up doing some very funny demonstrations with this, where I literally play catch with a Roomba.
Nice. Nice.
So it was, that was a different sort of experience. I thought for a long time that it was a very, very non-political company. And eventually realized it's actually highly, highly political, but I was so far out of the loop, I couldn't see it. So anyhow, I was there for a few years. Mostly fun people to work with. There were serious problems with vision at the management level. Probably 3/4 of the company is gone now. The stock was once 131, at which point all the executives cashed out. And it now is, I don't know, $8 or $9, which means the block of stock that I have left is not worth enough to help my kids buy a house. In fact, it's not worth enough to buy a new door. They ran the company to the ground, and they thought that the future of the company was to be bought out by Amazon. They ran into antitrust issues in Europe and eventually abandoned that. So what's left of the company is skeletal. I think they were approaching the point where they're just a licensing operation. And I think within a year, that's all will be left, is they'll be licensing the iRobot name to be stuck on basically robots designed in China and manufactured in China and having no connection to the former engineering team. So I think everybody I knew at iRobot is gone. Thankfully, some of them moved on to some very interesting stuff.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I got laid off in a let's get rid of the old men purge, and decided I did not care to get involved in an age discrimination lawsuit. I've had enough experience with lawyers in my life that I did not want to deal with it. It's not worth it. So I went back to consulting, and I worked on a number of things that wound up in a dumpster. Again, doesn't surprise me, doesn't really bother me. I watched one group that was making I'll just say athletic gadget. And they're, pardon me, kids, 20s to 30s. And I don't know if any of them have really been involved in shipping anything, but they wouldn't stop designing it. So, every month or two, I got different hardware to work on because they just couldn't restrain themselves. I don't know. But so I've worked on a number of different projects, and off the top of my head, I'm not going to remember very many of them. I'm working on one now, and I'm not about to say on a public venue what exactly it does, but it has plus or minus 3,000-volt power supplies on, which is an interesting experience. I've only shocked myself on the 3,000-volt line once. There's very little power behind it, so it's not going to kill me. It also has a set of plus or minus 600-volt power supplies, and I've hit them more than once, but only a few times. But I'm an electrical engineer. I'm allowed to stick my fingers in electrical sockets. So what's the heck? So yeah, I'm back to consulting. And I'm back to being involved in hardware design, which I really haven't been. This was a project where, again, somebody had a version of the project and they basically handed to me and said, please fix this. And I'd been given the impression it was mostly going to be firmware work. And when I started looking at the hardware, I realized that almost everything on the board was unobtainium. This was during the pandemic and a lot of stuff was becoming unavailable. So I had to design out a lot of this stuff. And I've written them, they had essentially no documentation for the project. So I've written them a lot of documentation and pointed out that, sections of the circuits didn't actually do what they were intended to do. But it took a while just to get straight answers about what was known to work and what wasn't known to work. But I'm responsible for all the hardware and all the firmware, and worry a lot about failures that have occurred in testing because they need a 10-year lifetime on the product. So that's what I'm doing. Same sort of
Excellent.
thing.
Great.
I'm vastly older than most of the people I see in the field. But I have, my formal background several hundred years ago was mostly hardware, mostly analog hardware. And, unfortunately, nobody had the courtesy to simply tell me when I was in college, you do know, kid, you're never going to find a job as a junior analog engineer. And when the industry complains about finding analog engineers, my inclination is to just laugh at them. Well, I mean, this is a very much a side story. I had the experience when I was still a student. Paul Brokaw of Analog Devices came out to where I was at school, which was Cornell University. And I'll toot my own horn and say it's one of the best engineering schools in the world. And Paul Brokaw from Analog Devices came out recruiting and had some interesting things to show us. And invited me back to Massachusetts for an in-house interview. I showed up at the hotel that I was told to stay at, and then nobody had made a reservation for me. And again, if the young ones are listening, they did not hand out credit cards to students in those days. And I had $31 and some change in my pocket, and a hotel room cost 30 and some change. So at least I could find someplace to stay for the night. I went through the whole interview process, and then when it was all done, somebody discovered they had no program in place for dealing with junior engineers. So they offered me a job as a technician with no guarantee they'd ever make me an engineer. That's what they thought I was going to do with my Ivy League engineering degree. So, no thanks.
Oh, yeah. Huh. Oh, okay.
So anyhow, that covers a brief version of my career, although we spent most of our time talking about Parker, which I think is what you wanted anyway.
Yeah.
And I'll say again, it amazes me that people take an interest in this stuff.
Well, I appreciate your time, and we do have an interest, and love to see how these things were made.
That's kind of
there's
the
a vision
key.
of it, I think, of being, we got to stay up all night, play games, but I mean, you clearly had serious problems with management, and rightfully so, and it was not all fun and
Not
game
all fun and
enjoy.
games.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Parker suffered from a problem, actually, a problem that some audio companies are famous for is expecting people to simply show up at their doorstep and say, beat me senseless, pay me nothing, but let me work here. I know some audio companies that are like that, and it's not sustainable.
Right. And it's still happening in the world of video game companies
Yeah, my,
today. I mean, yeah.
yeah, my understanding is you got a lot of very ambitious gamers who want to work in the field, and they wind up working absurd hours and get paid very poorly. You can correct me if I'm wrong there, but that's the impression I've gotten.
That's the impression I get too. But yeah.
I've never attempted to re-enter the game field, other than the non-curriculum stuff I did years ago. And I certainly don't care to let somebody beat me senseless.
Sure. That's no good. I think I have what I need. Thank you, Steve. This is great.
Okay.
Thank you. If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, please consider supporting my Patreon at patreon.com/Savitz. I've been publishing interviews like these since 2013 and would like to continue doing so for a long time, and your financial support will help. Thanks.